Hi, everyone. A warm welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait for another couple of minutes for everyone to join, but a warm welcome. So again, before we officially start the webinar, just a kind of few housekeeping items. Your lines as attendees will be muted, so don't try to share your excitement about what we discuss right now. But if you do have a question, please enter these questions in the Q&A box. We actually reserve like 20 minutes, 1/3 of the webinar to your questions from the audience. So we'll be delighted to receive them and address them at the second part of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded, just a short notice to that. And I guess we can officially start. Perfect. So welcome to Breakthroughs in Biotech and Insights from Insiders, organized by American Federation of Aging Research. Your moderator today is Sergey. I'm a founder of Longevity Vision Fund, and I'm very proud to be a board member in AFAR. Just shortly about our host today, it's for more than 40 years, the American Federation of Aging Research has been advancing the science of healthy aging. AFAR provided roughly around 200 million to more than 4,000 investigators all around the world and in the US. AFAR also works with public and private funders to support high-quality grant programs and advanced aging research. Great. Our guests, our speakers today, first is Kristen Fortney, PhD. She's the CEO and co-founder of BioAge. In fact, Kristen is a AFAR grantee, so that's why we're really proud to have her on board today. Next is Jim Mellon, prominent longevity investor. Again, a AFAR board member, co-founder and deputy chairman of Juvenescence. And another good friend, CEO and co-founder of Cambrian Biopharma, James Peyer. So welcome to our webinar. Let's go. We'll discuss about how you can support AFAR's mission later, right in the end of our conversation. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, for the introduction. Each of you entered the field of healthy aging from unique places and unique perspectives. Why and how did you decide to focus your interest and your talents on aging biotech? And if you don't mind, I would like to start with Kristen, please.
Thanks, Sergey. Great to be here, everybody. So yeah, from a personal perspective, I went into the field of aging science very deliberately for my PhD, coming from more of a quantitative background in math and physics and computational biology. And I was very deliberately motivated by the idea that everyone here is likely familiar with, that there are these interventions that can dramatically extend life and health span in animals. And if that could be translated to humans, the potential would be enormous, right? So for my PhD, I focused on applying omics technologies to identify biomarkers and drug targets relevant to aging. And then for my postdoc, which was supported by AFAR, for which I'm very grateful, I actually got to study mechanisms of longevity in humans who are already aging very well. Like there are a lot of people, living examples that we can do better, people who live, past the age of 100 with functional muscle, with functional brain. And that was very related to the work at BioAge. So making the transition into longevity biotech again, like I was personally really excited about the idea of developing medicines that positively impact human lives, human health span. And while a lot of really important work happens in academia, that's sort of the first of many steps that you need to take to get a medicine out there.
Perfect. Thank you. Jim, please.
Thanks, Sergey. Well, I'm the only person on this call who doesn't have the scientific sort of credentials that the rest of you do. I studied philosophy, politics, and economics at university, which is not really relevant to what we're discussing today. But luckily, about 20 years ago, when I stopped being a fund manager, I teamed up with a couple of friends, and we got to back biotech companies in the days when biotech was hot. And we've had a couple of good successes. One was called Medivation, acquired by Pfizer, and the other one is called Biohaven, which was acquired by Pfizer as well. So you might think we've got an inside link to Pfizer, and actually we do, because Dec Dugan was the head of their R&D for a long period of time. Greg, my other partner, Greg Bailey, who many of you will know, is actually obsessed with staying alive in a healthy condition for a long period of time. And he does the stuff that we should all be doing. And I'm sure some of you do it, but most of us probably not, including restricting his calorie intake and doing lots of exercise and, being stress-free, et cetera, et cetera. And he wanted to pursue the aging field from the point of view of supplementation, prevention, clinics, and all that sort of stuff. And over time, we agreed, but actually we would go down the road of drug development. And so Juvenescence is a company which I'm non-executive in, but I'm a big backer of it. We've put between Greg and myself, about $100 million of our own money into the company. And I believe that this whole industry has vast opportunity. And it's right now, at this time, that we're at an inflection point where money, success, and excitement are combining to create great opportunities, but particularly for people like myself, because, having just lost my father at the age of 94, he lived a long life, but, if the therapies that are available in 10 years' time were available to him before he died, I think it would have been a very different situation for our family. And I want everyone that I know and love to benefit from all the great stuff that all these companies are undertaking.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing, Jim. James?
Sure. So I always have, there's like a couple different narratives that anyone can tell about how they ended up where they are, right? And so probably the most prominent that comes to mind for me, if Kristen approached the space from like the computational and kind of like tech side of things and made her way into biology, I came from it from more of a philosophical, like a philosophy path in some ways. Because when I really started getting excited about aging was when I was a teenager, and I had sort of the existential crisis of like, well, what does life mean? What is our purpose here? Like, those big philosophical questions. And as this was all happening, my grandfather was dying of cancer in his 80s. And as I watched him very unwillingly, right, go from living a full life to being dead, to succumbing to his cancer, I thought to myself, all right, well, this is the end point for all of us. So what greater thing could we struggle for than trying to maximize health and to get as much well-lived life as we can while we are here, for ourselves and those around us and others that this would be taken from. And I almost took that as a philosophical precept and then said, all right, now instead of going into math or into physics or something like that, I'm going to spend my life working on this aspect of biology. And then went towards my PhD based on that sort of like philosophical grounding.
Beautiful. Very interesting story, James. Very much related to how I end up with investing in longevity. Second question is for everyone as well. So what is the hardest thing that you have found about running the new company in the longevity and aging space? And I want to start with Kristen again. Please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a lot of things that are incredibly challenging about starting a new company in biotech, period, right? Like, this is a very challenging industry where, the failure rates at every stage are incredibly high. But to focus in perhaps especially on aging, like what are the unique challenges to our field? Part of it is like for example, at BioAge, we have a platform to find targets relevant to aging, and great, you have an aging drug, an aging mechanism. Now what? Like, what's your clinical trial? What's your first indication? How can you show that it's doing what you think it's doing in humans without waiting 20 years, without spending tens of millions of dollars? So a lot of work that we do, that I'm sure lots of the other companies here focus on as well, is, what's that first disease indication, and even what's that first mechanistic proof of concept I can do in a really efficient clinical trial? How can I de-risk that in animals? And this is challenging too, because often you have to do this in naturally aged animals, which are not a common model, right? So like that's one example of what's challenging, sort of just carving a path forward where you have to select a particular disease first, but still retain, like the promise. What all of us want is these ultimately to be drugs that are taken by healthy people past a certain age, like true aging drugs. So sort of carving that path forward too, not losing sight of the bigger picture as you execute on these near-term milestones. Yeah.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, I don't run
the hardest thing, yeah.
I don't run Juvenescence. We have a guy called Richard Marshall who comes from Astra, who runs it, and he's absolutely outstanding. But what I would say is that when we started Juvenescence, which was 6 and a bit years ago, I think the main impediment to us was that we had too much money rather than too little money, and to be quite honest, and that there were too many wackos who were promising the elixir of life. And I'm not going to mention any names, but we know who these people are. And that people could live to 1,000 years, and the first person amongst us was 200, was going to live to 200, et cetera, et cetera. All of that did the industry no favors at all. So what Kristen's saying is that, you have to focus on near-term commercial opportunities that may have a link to aging, measured by biomarkers, by clocks and so forth. But we absolutely have to be in the clinic with our products and laser focused on having near-term applications, which is what we are. And I think the industry has now become, I wouldn't say totally respectable. I think there are still plenty of charlatans out there in the industry, but it is now gaining institutional respectability, which is the most important thing for it to succeed. And I've got no doubt, I don't know how it's going to be done. It may be done by Cambrian and by BioAge and possibly by Juvenescence and other companies that you've invested in, Sergey. But in the next 10 years, we're going to have some remarkable successes, which will offset the unfortunate failures that have characterized the industry up to now, which is another factor that unfortunately has added lead weights to our boots in terms of making progress.
Thank you. James, please.
So I would echo Kristen's characterization that specifically applied to the aging field. I think this question of how to select the right indication for your drug or for your innovation is like the hardest problem to get right. And given that the theme of today is like getting into biotech, I'm going to give like a slightly different answer, which is not just like if you're starting a new company, but in general, if you're making the jump from academia to biotech. I think one of the things that took longest for me to hammer into my head is what I viewed as like all of science in terms of like doing research, understanding mechanisms, and ultimately finding a drug, in my case, that could extend lifespan or treat a disease or something like that. That is part 1 of 9 in what we characterize as, getting a drug out there and to patients and on the market. And especially the middle bits of preclinical between discovering that tool compound and getting a drug into clinical trials. It's important to understand that like that's where most people in biotech work, right? They are trying to figure out how to take that discovery and get it from, target to hit to lead to candidate to IND. And like each of those phases have so much work baked into them that, especially coming from the genetics and biology background, I had no appreciation for before coming into the field. And so I think that's the flag that I wave to people who are entering the space now. And it's like actively search out those pockets of ignorance there and understand how hard those transitions are.
Very interesting. Thank you. The next question is for Jim, because it's more from investment perspective. So Jim, for a new investor entering this space, what advice you give them about where to start? If people want to invest in like aging research, fighting aging, longevity, where to start?
Probably to invest in your fund, Sergey. I mean, I do think that spreading your risk across multiple opportunities is a good idea. I wouldn't put all my eggs in one basket. It would be a good idea to invest in a fund. There are a number of funds now, of which I think yours was probably the first, that invests in opportunities across the longevity space. And so I would recommend investing in a fund. I think it's too hard for investors coming new to the space to just invest directly in an individual company, unless they're institutional investors and they have large pots of money and they can invest in multiple companies. But I wouldn't invest in just one company.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's just too early, like, to make one bet. And I would always look at the portfolio of interest and investments as well. I agree. Well, the other perspective is for people who just want to start a new project or create startup and enter this space. So the question to Kristen and James, what advice would you give them which can actually make or break their success? And let's, James, if you can start.
So the most important thing, I guess, to talk about right now is to understand the market that we're in. Right now, early stage biotech is actually in a really tough place. And companies that got started in the bull years, right, from like 2014 up through 2021, they had very different rules than biotech companies that are starting today, especially early preclinical efforts. And early preclinical efforts today are so hard to get funded unless you've already got sort of a bird in the hand. And so really creative business strategies and access to funding and so on, like the advice that I give is you almost need that before saying, I'm going to go out on this big adventure, which is not a very optimistic message to send. But like the funding environment for early preclinical stage stuff is just so bad right now. I don't want to occupy too much more airtime, but like that access to funding and that network is like the number one thing that is determining success or failure for companies today, more so even than the quality of the scientific idea.
Perfect. Very interesting. Kristen, please.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, to echo James, it is hard right now. It's like a hard time to start something new, which is a shame, right? Because a lot of these new ideas that are going to be especially impactful, new targets, right? I would say that biotech right now, like investors are looking more for targets that have already proven themselves in the clinic, right? So things that are really new biology, new insights that can be more transformative aren't going to be funded as much. That will get better, because medicines work, medicines save lives. So I think everyone expects the sector to recover. But in the meanwhile, right? Like if you're someone early career and you have an idea, you have a target you're really excited about, what can you do, right? Like there are, I think you can get to meaningful milestones with grant funding. And from turning this into a real product perspective, I would say that, as one piece of advice, one of the most important things you could do, and is just get help, right? Like I would completely agree with what James said. Like one of the things that you learn when you get into a company is that great, you find a great target, great, your mouse model works wonderful, great. You even have a lead drug, wonderful. But there's so much else to do. And you can de-risk a lot of that early, and you can learn a lot more about what that landscape looks like by speaking with the right people. And they'll want to talk to you, right? Like it's usually a very open community of people who've been successful in drug development. They love to hear about new, exciting ideas. You can get a lot of like really informative feedback that informs what you do by having those conversations, by bringing on the right advisors and mentors.
Perfect. Very interesting. You just answered my next question, which were meant for you. What are the key stakeholders and relationships that you need to develop early on? What you would add? It's probably like prospective investors, right? Like a funding partners. Anyone else?
Yeah, that's a great question. And and the right partners and investors will differ based on the stage of your company too, right? It'll be a different class of people who are excited about your scientific idea versus they're excited about the later stage data and the prospects there. And in some ways, this network will grow organically over time, right? I mean, all of us start with zero network. They find those initial believers and they sort of build over time. But in terms of what's the most valuable, yes, of course, access to capital, right? Someone who is excited by your idea and will pay for it. And this can be a seed investor. This can also be a grant agency, right? There's a lot of new opportunities there as well, especially for that first couple million to get you to really important preclinical milestones. But yeah, expertise, right? Like especially, I would say on the clinical front. So a lot of chief medical officers, like I initially thought, oh, you know, we don't need that for a few years, you know, the clinic is so far away, but that really like where you're aiming for in the clinic, that sort of constrains your preclinical development in a lot of like useful ways. Like there's a lot of things you want to do very early and you can get a lot of perspective by talking to somebody about, you know, what indications, what POCs are practical in a clinical setting and how you can build for that over time. So clinical, I would say, is probably the most important for us. But of course, there's all the different aspects that we've touched on during this conversation, whether it's like regulatory or commercial or even just chemistry. And you know, a lot of the models used in academia are not considered to be translational or in biotech because they aren't very predictive of drug success. So you want to learn about that early as well. Those are some good examples.
Thank you, Kristen. Just remember, I was just reading a book from Dan Sullivan, and the whole notion of the book is like every time you face a new problem, think who, not how, right? And if we can retain the spirit of your answer, and especially helping young scientists and entrepreneurs with this network, yeah, I think that would be great. Always, I think the world is just abundant of, you know, so many expertise, and like the worst thing to do is just try to like solve the problem in your own box.
Yeah, I 100% agree, right? Like you never want to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to, right? Like if it's a problem that someone else has solved, great, like reach out and get their help, you know, because it's hard enough focusing on the new things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The next question is to Jim. And Jim, we just discussed today that it's just great to work on a portfolio level, you know, just investing in, you know, different hypotheses and different ideas as well. But what are the common bottlenecks for growth in your portfolio of interest and in your portfolio of investments in aging research, aging field, and longevity in terms of access to resources? Is it, you know, to do with regulations, access to capital, scientific talent? Jim, you're on mute.
Basically, with reference to the previous question as well, I think that there's a danger for people who are coming into this industry of spending too much time in conferences and going to what are basically echo chambers with the same people talking to each other in a self-congratulatory mode. So I do think that organizations like AFAR and Longevity Biotech Association, of which 4 founding members are on this call, are very worthwhile in terms of networking opportunities for new entrants to the field. I mean, I can't emphasize just how difficult this all is. The problem is that although the best science is probably in the United States, generally speaking in the United States, it's an extremely expensive place to do business, especially in California, as we all know. And you can run through money incredibly quickly in the US. If there was a way in which, you know, cheaper locations could be used for research and trials and so forth, and yet be acceptable to the FDA, that would be a big positive for our industry, because the United States, for some reason, manages to burn through 3 times more money than, for instance, comparable companies in Europe on a per outcome basis. I think that also teaming up as we've done, because we don't have the strong research background that Kristen and James have, with research institutes where we can back their scientist entrepreneurs in companies, is a good strategy for people like us who are, you know, not aging specialists ab initio. And so we've got, you know, as an example, we've got joint ventures with the Buck or the Baker Institute and so forth. And that way we are linking up with research institutes that need money, need guidance from a business point of view, and provide us with a starting point for technology. But it's a difficult thing. I wouldn't advise people to go to every single conference around, because I just think you're wasting your time and your money probably, and you'll just meet the same people and talk to the same people all the time. But you should join the critical organizations, and you should try and link up with the key research institutions, and of course read as much as you can as well, which is what all of us do. Just read as much stuff as you can, and gradually you'll find out what the good stuff is and what the bad stuff is, and that will be a big step forward to success.
Thanks, Jim. Speaking of bottlenecks, we have an interesting question from the audience. Would the same study, which is another AFAR initiative, help you raise funds for your companies, or have a different approach for another clinical trial that would be lucrative? Yeah, I guess it's, yeah, let's start with James.
Sure. I also can't help but notice the name of that questioner as I pick it up. So hi,
Yeah,
hi, Nir.
I think we know who's that. Yeah.
So I think the answer to this question is tied in with a topic we touched on at the beginning, which is about how do you pick the right indication to bring drugs that target aging into the clinic. And so TAME and other trials that kind of try to do the same thing, these are prevention trials, right? Something where you give a relatively healthy group of people an intervention, and then you see how long you can keep them healthy, right? Like, can you keep them compared to a placebo more healthy, less likely to get a new condition? And this is sort of like the best and highest use of what a drug developed in the aging space is supposed to do. But from the perspective of building a company and like ending up in biotech today, it's actually a second order problem, right? The first order problem is how can we get a drug to show safety and efficacy and get on the market today? And then the second order problem is, all right, now how do we expand the applicable uses of this drug towards closer and closer to prevention? If the drug is suitable to do that. And so TAME or another primary prevention trial would be an enormous boon for the industry, because the way that we could then talk about it is today, and I'll give you an example. When we raised money for Cambrian, which has now been a fair amount of money, like $175 million, what we said is we're going to take each of these drugs, we have 15 different drugs, all have applications to prevention and longevity in some way. And what we told our investors is set the value of that to 0, right? Assume that it has no value. And now let's just talk about the value of each of these for the specific diseases that they're going in for. And that's fine, especially as the industry is getting started. But as soon as you have a proof of concept for one of these indication expansion and prevention type of trials, then we can start pointing in that and say, the value of that, it is going to be non-zero. And like, here is the path, kind of like the tracks in the snow that we can follow to get there, that right now is still a bit of a winter wonderland that needs to be explored.
Perfect, thank you. I actually like the idea of integrating audience question in our conversation. So if you don't mind, I'll ask another one. And Kristen, if you can address this one, what would you do differently if you had to restart your company again?
What would I do differently? Gosh, I mean, a lot of things, right?
Please.
I feel like I could get, mostly it feels like you could do what mattered faster, right? There's a lot of directions that you would know or would be less fruitful, I guess, right? So bringing in the right expertise faster. Focusing on areas that I now know are like translational and have a clear path faster. It's mostly that sort of type of thing, I guess, right? So yeah, just to briefly add, because I think it's an important question. Like, imagine a world where the TAME trial worked. Like, what would that mean for the industry? And I think all of us talk about how, the aging field as it exists today is much more widely accepted than 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, there was Calico. There wasn't. Now there's like a whole bunch of us that are like near IND or in the clinic. And even large pharma is starting to look towards aging, but they're not really spending on it yet, right? So I think we're all excited by the prospect of an aging mechanism that's sort of clinically validated and how that could unlock further interest in the field. So that's another, I think, aspect that, that could be one of our drugs, that could be TAME. But that's going to be really an important transition point, I think, for the industry, because we're still very much at the beginning, right? Like, in some ways we've gone so far, like there's 20 odd drugs in the clinic that I think are aging mechanisms, right? But look at the pipeline of any large pharma, like Novartis or something that's got, well over 100 different mechanisms in the clinic. Still got a long way to go. Yeah.
I agree. Very interesting. Well, let's talk about the other bottleneck, which is biomarkers for aging. And that's the question for James. Why is it a big challenge? Is there anything that you do within your portfolio which address that?
So I think this is a perfect one to come after the discussion we just had about TAME, right? Because if we talked about prevention trials being sort of a second order question in this space, I would say the biomarkers are the third order question, depending on who you talk to and how they want to approach the space. But the way that I look at it is that at the start, you have to get a drug approved and on the market for something. And the biomarkers that come out of those sorts of studies are not like aging clocks, right? They're usually specific biomarkers tied to the molecular mechanisms or the specific disease that's being addressed in those first studies. So when we talk about aging biomarkers, I leave that out. Then you have studies like what TAME would be, right? Prevention-focused outcome studies, where you hope to learn at long last whether these different putative biomarkers, like aging clocks and others, really work, whether they're really correlated with outcomes. And then you finally get to sort of what I think of as the final form, right? You have your 3 Pokemon stages, and this is the third Pokemon stage of the aging space, where now all of a sudden, if you have a validated biomarker or set of biomarkers, then that can presage disease risk. Now you can run trials that measure the biomarker and not the outcome, which reduces the cost and time of running trials by an order of magnitude, and will really let the field fly. And so I think that this is one of the big joint goals for the field. There are a number of different approaches. I think we're seeing a lot of thoughtful exploratory work begin to happen here. At Cambrian, we've spent almost all of our data science energies on creating a foundation where we can measure all of the different putative aging clocks in each of our clinical trials and then integrate them into the same database, right? And so there's going to be a bunch of efforts and hopefully coordination between efforts from different groups to kind of play with these. But I think we'll really start seeing the spending and the urgency of this ramp up once the milestone Kristen talked about and have one of the aging mechanisms validated in the clinic, right? Have that first column kind of conquered. Then we're going to see an explosion looking at this column 3.
Thank you. Well, the next question is about AI. How can we avoid discussing that? So, I guess it's for Kristen and for James. How important can AI be for starting longevity startup today? And is it must do, or it can be integrated at the later stage of development? Kristen,
sure.
please.
I mean, yeah, it depends on what it's for, right? So to generalize a bit, but I think that unbiased data first approaches still have a lot to teach us, about aging biology, about novel pathways that matter. And that's how we're approaching discovery at BioAge. Aging biology especially. It's still in early days science. We're still making big discoveries, every few years, right? So looking in a more unbiased way instead of under the lamppost, right, as the usual analogy, I think will yield important new targets. So it's that sort of taking AI, that's taking software and algorithms to the right data sets to find targets. I actually think in the nearer term, where AI is going to be more important for biotech generally, is I think we have seen advances in terms of finding a molecule, right? So if you have a target you want to hit, now you have to build something that hits it and has the properties that you want. That's a really hard, complicated problem that we are seeing AI accelerate. Whether it's, de novo, entirely in silico, predicting what's going to stick to your protein, or whether it's something like, iterative DNA encoded libraries where you're measuring billions of molecules and their binding affinity and learning what sticks really well from the data, right? So I think that those hit to lead in biotech in general is a really hard problem. So I think that like I would definitely, you know, we always use like a component of that really when we can. There are aspects, of course, of biotechs that are not going to be, you know, revolutionized anytime soon. And that's things like clinical trials themselves. Like we're terrible at predicting what's going to happen in the clinic, even after we do all this mouse work, even after we do all this mouse safety work. And in large part, that's because, you know, like we can't simulate how a human is going to respond to a drug. And we can't train a model to simulate that because we lack the data. Like what are the data sets that are going to train your AI to behave like a human, right? So I think that's further off, but I think that components of AI are going to become critical in aspects of drug discovery and development across the board. For aging and other fields that are more new, I think that's important in target discovery. And more broadly, I think that's true in molecule building. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. James?
I don't have too much to add except a mantra that I've unapologetically stolen from the chief AI officer at Exscientia, who I was talking with about, you know, all of this AI stuff. And what she said is there are some AI companies in biotech that are bouncing around out there that are really AI companies. But for most efforts in biotech, the important thing is to be a computer literate company, not exactly an AI company. And so when we think about our strategy at Cambrian, we're not a bunch of AI people, but we use all of these tools across the whole ecosystem and try to integrate them and think critically about how do we become a modern computer literate biotech company or pharma company. And I think for especially people coming from the scientific world or the biology and chemistry world, asking that question and keeping that fresh in your mind as the landscape is changing rapidly will move you in the right direction.
Yes, thank you. Like 80% of the companies in Longevity Vision Fund use AI as an enabler. But I think we're living in a world where AI will become, you know, accessible rather than something that you would need to develop from the day one inside your startup. Otherwise, it's just too demanding, specifically for this whole theme of AI. So let's talk a little bit about fundraising, about access to capital. And before I turn to Jim, I wanted to ask the question to James and Kristen, which is about where should young entrepreneur to start to find seed funding for an idea? Kristen, please.
Sure. Gosh. Like there's still a few places in the world where you have a physical advantage in being there, right? I mean, like for me, founding BioAge in California, I think was really critical because there's a large community of people who do seed investing, who will do seed investing in ideas that are higher risk, higher reward, which is still most things in aging, you know. I think that's been democratized a bit, right? There's much more like video pitches now, right? So you can still access this community, even if you're not physically located there. But I would say go and visit, right? Even if you're just going to some aging conferences that are in the Bay Area, there's a ton of them. All the usual seed investors go there too, right? There's other groups you can, you know, present and pitch and get your story out where you'll sort of get access, right? I feel like there's a large community of folks that do, especially the earliest side of longevity investing, and they are well represented at the usual conferences, as well as at as well as sort of, I would say, especially in California. Yeah.
James,
I would add on that seed is definitely the easiest right now. Series A, B's, and C, A's, B's, and C's are where we're seeing the compression in the space, and so in addition to what Kristen mentioned, the obvious shout out that I would give that was cool news in the space is a longtime friend, I think, of all of ours, Laura Deming, along with Alex Colville, just closed their new Age 1 fund, which grew out of Longevity Fund, that is doing explicitly early stage investing in the space. And there's, I think, a series of folks around that. Cambrian is also still doing some. I actually signed the docs for a new spin out that we're doing with an AFAR affiliated academic, actually, just a couple weeks ago.
Thank you. Jim, the question to you. So what does the field need to achieve in the next 5 years or so to attract new sources of capital, new entrepreneurs, new scientists?
I'm sure we can all agree on this, and it's basically visible success, isn't it? You know, I mentioned earlier on that the failure of some high-profile companies like Unity and Restore Bio didn't do any favors for the sector, and especially since the there was a lot of attention paid to the founders of those companies, and particularly in Unity there was a very high profile, and so we just need some success. And I feel that, you know, Kristen's going to have success, James is going to have success. I know that I think that we're going to have a big announcement next year in Juvenescence, which will be a successful announcement. So we need lots of these companies to have something that people can hang their hat on and say, actually, aging is a field I want to invest in. Something you talked about, seed funding, just as a point that probably isn't noted, in the UK, we have incredibly good tax breaks for early stage investors in venture capital in biotech. And the taxpayer can get basically all their tax back if they invest in a venture capital company or a venture capital fund. So if you're looking for a seed investors, there are plenty of them in the UK. And so all you have to do is to set up a branch in the UK and you can get that money. And honestly, it's worthwhile, because as far as I'm aware, it's not available anywhere else in the world. And you get basically half your money back if you make the investment. And if it fails, then you've only lost half your money.
The thing I would add on to that, Jim, is that if there are like budding biotech entrepreneurs in the audience here, I would make a shout out for contacting Risa Starr, who's the executive director of the LBA, who is starting to be a bit of a hub of, you know, because like getting that network that we were talking about, like how do you find all of the investors that are interested in that space? And Risa, as head of the LBA, has kind of started forming a bit of gravity where you could go and contact her, and then she could help say, oh, well, I'm in touch with so-and-so different longevity investors that are interested in early stage. Or even, I think LBA is on the verge of even creating a portal through which you can access kind of and see who is out there in the ecosystem that wants to be doing this stuff actively.
Yeah,
that's a pretty good point.
Yeah, I would also mention that a number of early stage companies that we're looking at right now through LVF perspective use non-dilutive funding. You know, AFAR grants is just, you know, one of the examples of that. So we shouldn't, like, every time we think about the capital, it should not be capital from commercial investors, but it can be like pro bono granting type of capital as well. So I think it's very important as well. Kristen, you mentioned already the challenges of transitioning from academic setting to a private research environment. And I can see there's a question around this: how can traditional research institution can better partner with private biotech? James, do you have any advice how we can actually address this, turning scientists to entrepreneurs, like the biggest challenge of our life and our work?
So I have like probably a less San Francisco entrepreneur forward view on this, a little bit more of like a crotchety old man opinion, in that I actually think that we have no shortage of entrepreneurial talent in the longevity space. I think that makes me a minority within our group. I think that the thing that many folks who want to be entrepreneurs in the longevity space should do is go work for a much bigger organization to learn the traditional ropes of drug development, and then let the connections between their enthusiasm about the space kind of sync up with experience that comes from a completely like a more traditional field, and then let those things fuse together into slightly more mature organizations. That's in general the pattern of success that you see in biotech. Not that there are not exceptions, there are scores. But my advice to people is generally, you know, it's not always the best idea to say, okay, I finished my postdoc, like let's go start a company and like figure things out along the way, even though, you know, that's very close to what I did. That's kind of what Kristen did. Like that, it's not the wrong model, but I think that where there's almost the greatest good to be done for the field is to bring in people who have an interest in this space, but then also have expertise developed in other stuff to come in. And that's a bit of a crotchety old man view. I respect that.
Very interesting. We have more interesting question from the audience, and I just want to link it with the questions that we discussed before. So the question is it always, have to be something with the drugs? Because the default mode is like longevity, aging, let's work on drugs. But like, and this is the question to all of you. If you were to launch a new longevity company today, which scientific or technological areas would you focus on today? Yeah, let's start with Jim.
I'm just checking that I'm unmuted.
Yeah. You okay?
Well,
yeah,
I think we would avoid all the mistakes we've made so far. That would be a good starting point. And I don't want to go into those mistakes, but there've been plenty of them. I think I would focus on nearer term commercial opportunities rather than on moonshot stuff. And if I, could relive the moment, but everything is a learning process. And, as with James and with Kristen, we're going to have plenty of clinical assets by the end of next year. And we hope to be able to drive at least 2 or 3 of them into commercial applications. And that's what you need in biotech. And if we could get 5 or 6 companies comparable to our companies to do the same, we have a very viable industry. And what I hope is that the traditional big pharma companies don't come along and buy all the companies up and then, go back to their normal ways, because this is an industry that deserves to be nurtured and not acquired at an early stage. We really need all of us to try and keep going for as long as possible before selling out to the big boys.
Thank you. Kristen.
Sure. I mean, I think those things that will have the largest impact are going to be drugs, or gene or cell therapies, or maybe even organ transplants, right? Like there's sort of categories of things. I think the question was sort of around diet, I guess, and that's a different kind of business model. I mean, there are some companies that are doing that, like Prolon, but then how do you sort of have scientific rigor, and then how do you profit at the end? And it's a very different type of activity, I guess. And yeah, I think that's interesting science too, but I think a lot of that can probably be done in a non-commercial setting. Great.
James, anything to add?
No, I think not beyond what Jim and Kristen have already said.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Well, the other question we did discuss, and there's a question from the audience as well. And do remember that our audience is not only US based, but it comes from all around the world. What are the different geographies that you would reach out if you need something? Are there like sources of capital or scientific talents, or even like doing a trial outside the US? And so what is the geographical aspect of your work? Or is it more like US focused, or you can actually be more international in what you do?
I can maybe jump in on that. I'll jump in on that one first, because I was smiling a little bit when Jim was saying like, oh, if only you could have access to the US, but then like be running things ex-US. And like that is almost the business case thesis for Cambrian, right? I started my first company, which was the Apollo Ventures Fund, in Germany, actually. And a bunch of the early stage research that I helped turn into companies before starting Cambrian was great European science that we then housed in American corporate entities. Israel has actually been doing this with like a Tel Aviv research site, but a Boston-based operational team for a long time. And so I think that biotech, almost more so than any other of the deep technology industries, can function in a highly globalized environment. Right? Biotech people were on Zoom before the pandemic, 8 hours a day. And so I think that structure of like a US or UK kind of like center of gravity, but then with tendrils wherever the academic breakthroughs are happening across the world is a great model. The clinical trials that we're running or about to start are actually all ex-US, even though all of our companies are US. And it's only in like later stage, larger phase 2B, phase 3 trials that you want to make sure that you're opening US sites to comply with FDA. So yeah, I think there's this highly globalized environment. The only really sad thing that I would just throw in here that is happening is the decoupling with China. And so, you know, I think there was a time 5 years ago where a lot of us were quite enthusiastic about the increased in like IP things were on the upswing, and it seemed like there was going to be a greater enmeshment between the scientific ecosystems between US and China, but now that's going in the opposite direction. And so I think we're missing out on a lot of great brain power there from our Chinese colleagues. But other than that, I think the rest of the world is just becoming more and more enmeshed scientifically, and it's becoming easier to run things all across the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Kristen,
Yeah,
Jim,
just to
anything
add to that. Yeah, so like a lot of biotech development opportunities and activities are international, and I hadn't, you know, realized that early on either. But just to give you a very concrete example, for one of our drugs, it's going into phase 1 next year. We got all the chemistry, like we did a DNA encoded library screen with HitGen in China. We did all the hit to lead discovery with WuXi in China. They've been a wonderful partner, right? Like a lot of that, we don't have our own chemistry internally. You don't need to have your own chemistry internally. You can run that through you know, what is a very cost-effective, very high quality CRO. And that drug, you know, when it goes into the clinic next year, the phase 1 will be likely in New Zealand or Australia, where you could run a phase 1 trial for roughly half the cost of what it is in the US, but it's perfectly acceptable to FDA. And where you also have a faster startup as well, which is also highly relevant to a biotech because time is money. Keeping your operation alive for every month is very costly, right? So those are some aspects of how we are.
Thanks, Kristen.
Yeah.
Can I just say something here, Sergey? And that is that, you know, I think some entrepreneurs are still living in the era of 2 or 3 years ago and fancy their valuations as being very high. And there's a famous Silicon Valley saying, I don't know who said it, but the time to eat the canapes is when they're being handed around. I think you really have to accept, as James emphasized earlier on, that this is a really tough time to raise money in biotech. And if you are offered money, I'd give it a very good thought through and accept it probably, rather than, you know, try and hold out for a higher valuation. And in terms of where the pots of money are for starting companies, I mentioned the UK. Obviously, there's a lot of money in the US, but I think those are the 2 key areas. You and I know the Middle East very well, Sergey, but that's for a later stage stuff. And honestly, it takes years and years and years of effort to make those relationships work. And for a startup company, it's just not going to happen.
True. We have only 3 minutes to run, and I have a final question to 3 of you. And the question is, I guess from my experience, it's easier to sell the longevity and aging research field to an older person. Like I'm 51, you know, I can perfectly understand what are the benefits for me today or in the future. So what is the deal for younger generation of scientists and entrepreneurs? Why, you know, if the field of aging and longevity is so exciting? Enough. If I can keep you asked to keep your answers relatively short. Yeah, Kristen, please.
Sure. Yeah, just to be really brief, but aging, you know, unlike any other disease, it happens to everybody, right? And you know, even if younger people aren't worried about themselves, they certainly are worried about their parents and their older relatives. I mean, they'll be worried about their children one day. So I you know, I think that's very compelling. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. James.
The way that I conceptualize this, and we've been asked this question, I think, all 3 of us in many different ways. I'm pretty sure actually Kristen and Jim and I did a podcast together whose explicit like full hour was just Jim asking me and Kristen, like, what's with all the young people in aging?
Yeah.
And my answer to this is that I think that aging is just where some of the most exciting things in biology generally are happening over the last 10 and the next 10 years. So just like you saw like a huge rush into oncology after the discovery of oncogenes, a huge rush into genomics after we sequenced the genome, right? I think that the breakthroughs in aging research are just bringing, because there's so much opportunity, there's so many unanswered questions scientifically, that is just bringing people in because that's where our science has progressed to. And I think that's actually the best thing about where this space is right now, is that it's not like a, ooh, what about aging research? It's actually this, oh my God, aging research is going to take over the way that we look at biology and medicine.
Perfect. Thank you.
My final point on this, Sergey, is that this is not just a nice idea for people like Jeff Bezos to live longer and to parade around on his expensive boats or put rockets to Mars. This is an imperative for society. We are living in a demographic crisis like none other before. You know, most people on this call will be familiar with this, but I'm going to repeat it. By 2070, half of the G7 will be over 65 years old. Unless we can keep those people healthier for longer, working longer, we're going to have a whole load of 90 to 100-year-olds who will be incapable of being looked after by themselves, and there won't be enough young people to look after them. We need to do something to extend healthy lifespan. Otherwise, societies will just literally break down. This is as important a crisis as the climate crisis. It's just not as visible. Japan currently has 125 million people. By 2100, it will have less than 50 million people. Singapore will be 1/3 of its current population by the year 2100. Korea will be half of its current population. Sorry, my dogs are hoping that they can live longer as well. So there is a absolute imperative for what you guys are doing, what we're all doing, to change the trajectory of aging. It's really important. Not just it's a nice idea, it's something we have to do.
Thank you. Thank you. John, I think we're ready for the last slide, because we will finish in a minute. Look, on behalf of AFAR, thanks to everyone who joined us today as a speaker or as attendee. We would like to have your support and your involvement in AFAR. So go to afar.org. And, you know, we would like to collaborate and receive your support to the extent that you can and you want. But otherwise, I think it was an amazing conversation. I want to do more and more of this. And thanks to everyone for their time today. And I'm very excited about our field and where it's all going. Thanks to everyone for the time today.
Thanks, Sergey.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you, everyone.
Okay. Thanks. Bye, everyone.